As the world grapples with the question of climate change, of global warming, and on the world stage, countries rack their brains on how to hit targets to really save the planet, a very important part of that picture is what large companies do. How can companies control their emissions? And in fact, it's become a very important piece of how a company is defined and viewed by their shareholders and by their customers as well. In this special series, we focus on companies who are trying to be green warriors and are trying to make a difference. Today, we're talking about HUL, one of India's largest FMCG companies and home care solutions companies, which has recently announced that it has managed to go completely coal-free. Now, what does that mean for a company that size? And is that a model that can be emulated? To speak a bit on this, I'm joined today by Willem Uijen. He's the Executive Director of Supply Chain for HUL. Willem, great to have you on ET Now. Thank you so much for joining us. And let's begin by you giving us an overview on how and why this target was set to eliminate coal completely.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you very much for having me here today as well. It's a true pleasure to be here with you. What Unilever has done at a corporate level is, as part of its Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, which was launched about 10 years back, Unilever has made the commitment to come out of coal and find alternative uses for the energy that we need in all of our operations by the year of 2020. Now, by 2020, HUL has also achieved to go completely out of coal in all of its operations. That means in all of the factories that we run across the different states in India. But then in 2021, in April, we had the acquisition of the JSK, the former JSK business, that was the nutrition business for Boost and Horlicks, and that came with 3 new factories in our network. And these factories were using coal in the boilers or for the energy that they were using in their sites. Now, we have been able to make the changes in those sites, in those 3 new sites that we have in our network, in a little bit over a year, to move these sites away from coal and using biofuels. That means that we're using biomass in the boilers for the heat generation, and we're using renewable energy for the electricity provision in those sites as well. And therefore, once again, after that acquisition of the 3 new sites in our network, we have become completely coal-free in our operations.
You know, Mr. Willem, the big question with alternate fuels is, of course, cost becomes one, but over time it's also about sustainability and dependability. The context, if I may, would be the energy crisis we saw a few months ago across Europe when demand increased and your alternate fuels could not necessarily keep up. For a large corporation, was that a concern at all, and how do you account for that?
Yeah, so what is important in the sourcing of alternative fuels is, first of all, if you go for the biomass type of fuels, then the partnerships that you need to set up for the sourcing of that biomass needs to be in and around the facilities where you operate. So the sourcing of biomass materials for the generation of heat, to do that very far away from where you need that heat generation is not economically viable, and also it defeats the purpose a little bit, because then the transportation that you would have of that biomass into your factory or to the boilers where you need that biomass would require a lot of burning of fossil fuel again in the transport of that material. So it's key to set up those partnerships close to the facilities where you operate, and I think that automatically links in the communities that operate in and around the facilities, the manufacturing facilities that you have as a company. It links on those communities much closer as well to the manufacturing facilities that we operate in the country. I think second of all, what is important is to have the possibility to use different types of fuel. So if this is in biomass or is this any type of biofuel, to have the ability to be able to use different types of that biofuel over time, depending on what the availability of different types of biofuel are, or what the prices currently are in the market, is important to make sure that you have a continued supply of fuel, as you would have that normally with, let's say, natural gas, or you would have that with coal. But by setting up the right partnerships close to the facilities where you operate and have the ability to use different types of biofuel, the continued supply is not a problem.
The sustainability aside, the other side effect or impact of this is the impact it has on the communities around which you mentioned. How does this help farmer incomes, for example? And can this, can this sort of experiment be extended further to solve real-world issues like we see stubble burning, for example, in the northern parts of India?
Yeah, very, very good question. I think if I take the example of our factory, one of the 3 factories that I was talking about, where we moved recently into biofuels because of the acquisition that we had, it would be our factory in Sonipat in Haryana. And that's one of the factories that we have for Horlicks and Boost. That factory we have moved away from coal, first into natural gas, and now into complete biofuels, and we're using there actually briquettes that are made out of stubble. Now that stubble comes obviously from the farmlands around the factory in the vicinity of about 200 kilometers. That is also the stubble that, when we use that in briquettes for the burning in our boilers, we make sure that the way that stubble is being burned and that the exhaust of the boilers is being filtered, that is the cleanest possible burning that you can have. And thereby what happens obviously is that compared to the burning of that stubble on the normal farmer's land, where you would have the contamination of air, or the particles that come into air, the PM smaller than 2.5, that we all know from the air pollution in the capital, it is obviously avoided with that. Secondly, what happened, as you said, is that by making sure that we buy that stubble from the farmers, there is an additional income from the farmers for the provision of that stubble. And secondly, it generates also employment for the companies that are making the briquettes out of that stubble, such that we can use them into our boilers. So I think there is and a positive impact on the community with the incremental income for farmers, as well as incremental employment because of the facilities that need to be set up for making the briquettes, plus the positive environmental impact by having less air pollution, obviously.
In the big picture, I know that the company has a milestone set to be zero emission by 2030, and going coal-free, of course, is an important stepping stone. How will you set about achieving that? What are the other big milestones to cover?
Yes, so we have made, after the commitments that we had in our Unilever Sustainable Living Plan that has been running over the last 10 years, we have last year announced our program that we have, what we call our Compass. Unilever has a purpose to make a sustainable living commonplace, and that is obviously also the purpose that we have as Hindustan Unilever here in India. And we have launched our Compass that has 3 big objectives. It's about improving the health of the planet. It's about improving people's health, confidence, and well-being. So here you have to think about the nutritional value, for example, of the food products that we make. You have to think there about the replacement that we have in other countries of some of the meat-based products, to replace them with dairy alternatives. And there is a third pillar that is about contributing to a fairer and more socially inclusive world. That is very much about the role that we can play as a company in making sure that people have the skills that make them future ready for the jobs that will be there in the future. And we're looking there as well to make sure that everyone who is connected by delivering goods or services to Unilever, that they will earn a living wage or a living income by 2030 as well. Now, if I focus specifically on the health of the planet, which is the program that we launched last year, then we have the objectives in there to halve the greenhouse gases that we have for the impact of our products across the life cycle by 2030. And we're looking for net zero emissions from all of our products from the sourcing to the point of sale by 2039. And why the 2039? We're looking that we do that then over 10 years faster than has been set out in the Paris Agreement. And it basically means that we need to make sure that apart from our own operations, the use of the energy that we have in there for example, the boilers or the electrical energy that I was talking about earlier for our factories or our distribution centers, we also need to make sure then that for the materials that we source that go into our products, if that is in the production of, let's say, the packaging materials or the production of the, let's say, the agricultural materials or the chemicals that we use in the production of some of our products, all stack up to be zero emissions. That means zero carbon emissions, zero CO2 in the production of these materials by 2039. Now that is a big job to be done. We see now very clearly that we can achieve that in our own operations. I think what we're talking about today for coal is one example, but we've made all of the use of electricity in our network of factories from renewable sources as well over the last couple of years. So we clearly see that we can do this for our own network. It is now key that we take those practices that we have implemented in our own factories and work together with our suppliers and their suppliers to make sure that they can implement similar practices and become zero emissions as well.
Some of the biggest challenges towards going green, and this is of course true for smaller companies, but in the Indian context, it is the larger number of mid-sized and smaller companies which perhaps contribute more to pollution overall. One of the hiccups is cost. Does it cost more to go green? Now, you guys have talked about actually making savings in one of your home care plants, but can you elaborate on that? Is it an expensive affair for going green?
Yeah, I think the development of technology and the development of the ecosystems that are helping a larger group of companies to go green, as you say, that development is going very quickly. And with that development, we see overall the cost coming down as well. So if I look today at the electricity that we use, for example, the electricity that is coming from renewable sources, if that is through solar energy or aeolic energy, we see today already that the buying of that green electricity comes at a lower cost than the electricity that comes from the grid. And the electricity from the grid is mainly coal-based, as we all know. So there, I think it's for a large group of companies already possible to source electricity at a lower rate, green electricity compared to the regular electricity. I see that as well for the biofuel example that I was alluding to earlier. Currently, I see that biofuel already is competitive in cost, in end-to-end cost, compared to natural gas. There is still a little bit of an on-cost compared to coal. But I do expect that now that industry for biofuels is growing very quickly in India as well, with a company setting up larger operations and the industry for biofuels coming to maturity very quickly, that we will see with the development of that technology and a larger scale for that industry for biofuels as well, that price becomes competitive even versus coal. And I think that this is something that we see across the board. I can give you an example here, for example, for our materials that we use. We work here together with a company in Tuticorin that is making use of the carbon capture out of the emissions of one of their own plants. So it's taking the CO2 from the air, basically, that comes from the burning of fuels. And it's capturing that CO2 for the production of soda ash. So it's using that CO2 from the air directly for producing soda ash. And that soda ash is something that we use as a cleaning agent into our laundry products, as is the soda ash as you would normally have at home. And we use that in our laundry powders, for example. And we can produce that currently already at a cost that is better delivered at factory compared to the regularly sourced or the non-green soda ash. So we see that technology development, even for things that only a few years ago would have seemed not possible or not commercially viable, that they are becoming commercially viable already today, and that development is going very quickly. So I think, to your point, even for the smaller or the mid-sized companies, clearly there is parts in renewable energy, electricity, that I think we can all already tap into. And the development for biofuels or, for example, alternative materials, as I was mentioning, is going so quickly that I expect there that market will be open to any company that wants to use that in the future very soon as well.
As a policy measure, how do you think we should move ahead in encouraging and perhaps pushing forward companies to go green? Do you think there is enough cooperation right now in terms of policy, and what else can be done?
Yeah, great question as well. I think if we look at the last talks that happened in the COP26 in Glasgow, it's very clear that the work that needs to happen on tackling climate change, so the move to green, as we're talking about here, is something that cannot be done by governments alone. It requires a very close involvement from the public as well. It requires a very close involvement and activities from the industrial sector or from the private sector, as well as from the organizations that we have, such as NGOs, to drive the right programs and behavior in each of the markets. I do see that India is making great progress here. If we look at the amount of renewable energy, electricity, the commitments that have been made for 450 gigawatts coming online. If I see the commitments that have been made as well in terms of the transformation of the railroad network, and how we will reduce the amount of carbon emissions in there. It's clear that India is going in many ways at the forefront of this, and it's making a tremendous difference there, especially looking at the 1.4 billion people that we have living here in the country. I think specifically to your question on what still needs to be done, I do believe that in the private sector there is a role for, in particular, the larger companies to play to develop the partnerships and the ecosystems, as we were talking about today, for example, that renewable energy, or for the biofuels, or for the production of materials, as I was talking about. And I believe that if these companies do that, it also will allow mid-sized or smaller companies to tap into that. I do believe that it's very important as well that in particular for the mid-sized and smaller companies to have access to the ways of financing this transition, because it does require in many of the cases some upfront investment, which is a good investment that pays back with an attractive rate, but some investment is in many cases needed. That might be, for example, for solar panels, or it might be for the installation of the production of materials, as I was mentioning. So the systems that are being put in place to make sure that the small and medium-sized enterprises have access to finance or to loans as well, to make sure that they can make these investments is something very important to come through. And then I think it is very important that we set the right objectives as a country, or as we've seen coming through as well from the COP26, and that we're clear as well on how we will measure progress against these, how that will be done, and how every player in the value chain, if that is a company like HUL, or if that is a smaller mid-sized company, how we will all be held accountable for making sure that we make progress against these objectives. I think with these, and many of those already in place in India today, we will see fantastic progress.
Well, let's hope so. Let's hope so that this will be a start of something that will be widespread. Of course, it gives heart when large companies like HUL go green, move towards their milestone. But it will truly be a game changer when even mid-sized and smaller companies in India realize that going green is not necessarily an extra cost. It is a move towards sustainability. Thank you so much, Willem Uijen, for joining us today.
Thank you.